Is this? Oh yeah, no? Is this?
No, it's that one.
Yeah,
that's
right. Welcome everybody. This is a nice group. I see that there are a lot of people connected from remote, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you. Hello. Hello. Professor Bodo Winter, who is presenting today with us within the course of Lingue and Linguaggio. And Professor Bodo Winter is also one of the external collaborators, the external advisors on the board of the project that I am coordinating, which is called Abstraction, Unlocking Meaning from Experience Through Language, funded by a European grant. And we are lucky to have Bodo helping us with a more quantitative and statistical analysis and great scientific insights, ideas on how to address issues related to abstraction. He was here the whole week, and he will be here for the rest of the week to help us in our sub-projects, our team members, to sketch their research paths. Today, he will give a talk within the course, the grad course of Lingue and Linguaggio, which is an open talk, so external guests are welcome. And let me very briefly introduce Bodo. Bodo is now a professor of linguistics at Birmingham University in the UK, but he has been basically all over the place in the past several years, because he had done his undergrad degree in Germany, in Bologna, then his his master degree, his grad course in Hawaii, University of Manoa, Hawaii, his PhD in California, University of California at Merced with Tini Matlock, and then he moved back to Europe. Well, it was Europe. Now with Brexit, it's not even Europe. And now he is in the UK at Birmingham University. And he is head of research in his university. He has dozens and dozens of publications. But the most important thing, I think, to keep in mind for all of you is that he is basically one of the major, the front man, I would say, of the new generation of cognitive linguists. When we think of cognitive linguistics, which is a relatively recent discipline, subfield of linguistics, you may think of older professors, like LILEC, or I don't know, older cognitive linguists, and that's, yeah, okay, that's correct. But there is a new wave of a new generation of cognitive linguists, which I think is perfectly represented by Bodo, that address issues on the interface between language and cognition with different methods, bringing together different expertises in a quantitative method. So using a lot of tools and instruments and methods to address this interface between language and thought. And I think it makes the discipline stronger and more solid overall. So he is also editor-in-chief of the journal Language and Cognition. So and he published several articles in cognitive linguistics. His expertise is on iconicity, on sensory language, on methods, of course. He published the book Statistics for Linguists Using R, which is a must-have for all students who want to do, no, absolutely. And
I should give you some of the royalties.
No, absolutely. And recently he is now coordinating also a big project with a research team funded by the UK Research Institute, I think, is a scheme called the Future Leaders. And his project is about basically innumeracy. So we are used, being in a department of languages, we are used to talk about illiteracy. He is fighting against, his project is to solve the issue of innumeracy, basically. So the fact that a lot of people are not really able, we are not really able to understand numbers, to read graphs, to understand numbers, really. we are also, and that's his project, main project right now, but he's not going to talk about it today. We will invite him again to talk about that project. Today he's going to talk about iconicity, and so I leave to him the floor, and I'm very thankful for him to be here with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. So first of all, thank you for that very flattering introduction. Also, thank you for inviting me here for this week. It's been fantastic. Bologna is a fantastic city, and working with your team has been a lot of fun. So thank you for that. And also, hello everybody in this room, and hello everybody out there online. Can you hear this? Just to check, yeah? Okay, cool. Should work. Okay, so I'm going to be talking for about an hour. It's going to be a sort of big review of our research on iconicity. And the talk has a pretty boasty title. There's nothing arbitrary about the linguistic sign. And I hope to convince you of this idea at the end of this talk. But before I start, I just briefly need to mention that everything that I present today is sort of joint thinking together with my close friend and colleague Marcus Perlman. So we have had many walks along the canals of Birmingham thinking about iconicity and arbitrariness, and so I just want to say that everything that I'm presenting here is sort of the result of two minds that have worked together. Okay, so first of all, I want to introduce you to the topic. I think a lot of you might be already familiar with the classic distinctions between different types of signs. Traditionally, we distinguish between arbitrary, indexical, and iconic signs. And what we have to think about is how does form connect to meaning? And so arbitrary signs are those where there's no direct connection between the form and the meaning. So if we have something like tree, which is a classic example from Saussure, the word t, r, e, those sounds don't sound particularly tree-like. If we think about the form and meaning as two separate components, how are they linked? Well, there isn't really any direct link between the two. And that becomes apparent when you look at other languages. So if you make comparisons to other languages like Italian, you have albero, is a very different word for the same meaning. And in German, Baum, there's not a single sound that overlaps with the English word tree, and yet it means the same thing. And that seems to suggest that languages make arbitrary choices about how to put forms to meanings. And that's a topic that we'll sort of think about whether they really make arbitrary choices. Indexical forms are those that point to the meaning, so there's some direct spatial connection. So if I'm pointing at Mariana right now, and that's okay, then there's a direct sort of causal or spatial relationship between the form of this gesture and how I establish meaning. I'm not going to talk too much about indexical today. And then iconic are those signals where the form resembles the meaning. So for tree, actually, in the sign language, American Sign Language, the sign is like this. And that clearly mimics the meaning with aspects of this form. So this thing is the trunk, and this thing is the treetop. Yeah, so there's a clear resemblance relationship. And in spoken language, an example of iconicity is onomatopoeia. Yeah, so the word cuckoo sounds actually like the cuckoo. Yeah, and so there's a clear resemblance between the form and the meaning in this case. Now, traditionally, linguists emphasize the arbitrariness of language. Yeah, and I'm just going to pick a few sort of classic scholars here to introduce this idea. So William Dwight Whitney was a fierce opponent of the idea that iconicity and onomatopoeia would be important. And he said that inner and essential connection between idea and word, so between meaning and form, there's none in any language up on earth. Yeah, very strong statement. Every existing form of human speech is a body of arbitrary and conventional signs for thought, handed down by tradition from one generation to another. And so clearly conventions are important, but notice here that this is from the 19th century. This was before, for example, we recognize that sign languages are also languages. At that time, the linguistics was exclusively focused on speech. And he says speech as well. But also, he says there's none in any language upon earth at the time when nobody has actually done the research on this. There wasn't actually any empirical research on this topic. And so it's a sort of conviction. Yeah, it's a sort of statement without having actually assessed this empirically. Ferdinand de Saussure is probably the person that is most frequently cited here. So he actually sort of elevated arbitrariness to a principle of linguistics. So he was saying, principle number one, the arbitrary nature of the sign, it dominates all the linguistics of language. Its consequences are numberless. So he made it actually as the foundational principle of his classic book on linguistics. And that, by making it a principle, sort of reified it, made it a thing. And that is an important thing of linguistics. And then later, other scholars, based on this, have made it even more important in a way. So Charles Hawkins has a series of papers that is widely, a lot of textbooks start with the design features of language. So what makes language unique compared to animal communication systems? So what's uniquely human about language? And there are a bunch of different design features, and arbitrariness is one of them. Clearly, though, he was wrong about some of the design features. So for example, he said that language had to be vocal auditory, which we now know is not the case because signed languages are real languages. So this is sort of making us question whether the whole list, like some of this was, of course, at the time, and maybe there's an update needed, and we may want to rethink how important is arbitrariness. But I want to emphasize that by putting it on this list, he makes it a defining feature of our species. Yeah, the idea that there's no form meaning connection is now made to be uniquely human and different from animals. And that's really important, and you can sort of see why people then care very much about this topic in linguistics and cognitive science. So recently, there's been a rise of citations. So these are two studies that sort of like two review papers that have looked at the topic of iconicity or related topics like sign language, sound symbolism, and we've seen much more interest in cognitive science and linguistics in this topic. And I think this is partially because at the time, this was so frowned upon. So sometimes in science, you can have certain topics that you are not allowed to study because they're sort of like bad to study. And iconicity these days, the stigma or the taboo has been lifted. Yeah, and so there's now many more people interested in this. And the reason why people are interested in this, as I'll show you in this talk, is that there seems to be more iconicity than previously assumed. Yeah, so maybe there's just more than previous discussions said. So it's actually a feature of language. But also people have found that it may help in language learning and language evolution. So it may be that iconic words are easier to learn. And iconic signs are learned more early on by children acquiring sign language and so on. And it may actually be the piece of the puzzle for how language has started in the very first place. Because if you have no communication system to begin with, you have no conventions, maybe iconicity was one of the things that helped because you can sort of make meaning through resemblance and make yourself understood in the absence of conventions. So that's why people are really excited about it these days. Okay, but we do need to clearly define what we mean by iconicity. And in particular, this is the case because in this field, there's a lot of terminological debate and there's a lot of disagreement. And critics often point out that iconicity is a sort of ill-defined notion. Like, what do you really mean by this? And so I'm going to actually start with a really sort of quite wordy definition, sorry for that, but I will unpack this for you in turn. So a signal in any medium or modality exhibits iconicity if it is produced or perceived through a sense of resemblance between some aspect of its form and some aspect of its meaning. Now that's a pretty, we thought about this definition for a long time, and every component here matters. So I'm going to walk you through this and show you how it relates to some empirical research. So first of all, a signal in any medium or modality means that you can be iconic, you can do resemblance or imitation in speech or in gesture or in sign. So it doesn't matter, it's modality independent. And I'm going to give you an example of this. So this is not just onomatopoeias or conventionalized signs, but it's also things where, for example, in this study by actually my colleague Marcus Perlman, he asked people to talk about motion events that are slow or fast. Yeah. So if people have to read a story like this, Martha is a slow walker. She rarely exercises, but today she's out there. She labors slowly through the neighborhood. She struggles past some houses. Versus Martha is a fast runner. She always exercises, and today she's out there. She takes off quickly through the neighborhood. She dashes past some houses. And what they found in the study is that people actually read these stories faster. Yeah? And specifically, they read the verbs the fastest. And the verbs are, of course, the thing that are about the motion events. So struggles or labors, and as opposed to dash, people will pronounce that much more quickly. And the stories were matched for all sorts of length and frequency characteristics. And there are other findings since then. So this is not the only study that has found this. So this has been replicated. And so that seems to suggest that people iconically modulate their prosody or their speech rate in line with the meaning of what they're talking about. And this is modality independent, because you can do this in speech. So this is what these studies have shown, but actually there are other studies that have discussed that you can do this in sign language as well. If I have the sign for walking in a sign language, I can execute it more slowly. So I can sort of expressively modulate an existing sign in line with the meaning. And you can do this in writing as well. So there's a study that has looked at iconic letter replication. So you can write slow, which is a sort of modulation of an existing word. It is literally slower to read, but it also intensifies the slowness here. And there is a relation between the form and the meaning in the sense that there's more of it and it also takes longer to read. And that's a nice example of how people talk about speed in all three modalities. Yeah, so in speech, in sign, and in writing. So it's really a good example of how iconicity is modality independent. Okay, so that's that bit. Yeah, you can do it in any modality. Now, exhibits iconicity is an important detail. So I'm not saying is iconic. So I'm not saying iconicity is a categorical yes or no thing. So I say, oh, the word beep is iconic, because there's always elements of it that are also not iconic. Yeah, so exhibits iconicity says that something can have more or less iconicity. And this also means that we're thinking of iconicity as a gradable quantity, not as a categorical one. So if iconicity was about making an exact replica, yeah, like identity, yeah, so like the form is identical to the meaning, which would be hard to do in most circumstances. I mean, some people are really good at imitating animals, so much that the animals actually confuse this. Hunters do this. But generally, this is quite hard, and most things are not direct replicas. So, but it's about similarity, and something can be more or less similar, and therefore something can be more or less iconic. Yeah, that has to follow from the fact that similarity is gradable. Okay. And now I want to focus on some aspect of its form and some aspect of its meaning. So it's not the case that the entire form has to mimic meaning, and it's not the case that the entire thing has to mimic the entire meaning. So to give you an example of this particular aspect, or some aspect of its meaning, in sign languages, it's known that there's variation across sign languages about which aspect of a concept you select to depict. So here we have the concept of bird, and bird is a pretty big concept. It has lots of features: wings, beaks, clawed feet, feathers, and that it lays eggs and so on. And you can select any one of these elements to depict for imitation. And so in American Sign Language, people selected the beak. And so the sign for bird is this. in Turkish Sign Language, it is like this. So it's a different element of the overarching concept. Both are equally iconic, yeah, but they're just selecting different elements. Herbert Clark calls this selective depiction, yeah. So you're always selecting an element. And you can see why this kind of must be the case, because to some extent you cannot select, you cannot mimic an entire bird. I cannot just mold my hands to become a bird. And also it's a trivial impossibility to show the entire meaning, because, for example, I cannot change the color of my skin to mimic the color of the bird's feathers or the bird's beak. That's just impossible. So I always have to select an element, like in this case, shape. Okay, so here's one empirical study that I want to just briefly discuss that demonstrates the selective nature of iconicity with concrete experimental evidence. This was work that I did together with Julius Hassemer, and I should say, like sometimes you have papers that you that get cited a lot, and you're like, why do people cite this paper? It's not that interesting. This is a paper that I'm really proud of, that I think is criminally undercited, and I think it's because people think it's only about gestures. But because iconicity is modality independent, you can show something with gesture that is a general property of iconicity as well. So in this case, we're focusing on how people use their hands to show the size of an object or the shape of a round object. So you have, for example, a precision grip, where then you focus on the index finger and thumb pad, or a height gesture where you focus on the distance between these two. Yeah. Or I can show you a round object like a ball or the globe. Or you can also do this with a ring gesture, which is similar, but then you're sort of profiling a different aspect. And so we have sort of gestures that are more about size and gestures that are more about shape. And you can see here that iconicity also always sort of involves sort of some cognitive work, because the same, like you actually need to focus on a particular aspect of the hand. Yeah. But in this study, we've done multiple experiments on these particular gestures. Yeah, if you think this is, I think this is really exciting. But you can get into a lot of detail about this. But we know from previous studies that we've done that this one over here, where the middle ring and pinky finger interrupt the C shape, your attention actually goes towards the front. And people report more likely that this is a height gesture representing the size of an object. Yeah. So if I show you this and ask you what is this gesture about, you're going to more likely say this is size. Yeah. If I curl this upwards and the C shape is not interrupted, it's the same. This doesn't change. Yeah. Like this is the same. Then all of a sudden, people are much more likely to report that this is a shape gesture. This is showing you the shape. It's still possible to interpret the same one as a size gesture, but people then are more likely to focus on this. And what's cool about this is that this is a very small experimental system. It's like our fruit fly, where we can change size or shape interpretations simply depending on whether these are curled in or curled up. Yeah. And so in one of our studies, what we did is we just simply asked people, we showed them either this or that. Yeah, so we know that this one is more likely to be height, and this one is more likely to be shape, yeah, the shape of a round object. And we simply asked them, in your mind, what was the object's shape? Describe. Or, in your mind, what was the object's size? Describe. So simply eliciting text. Yeah, very simple task. We did this with 200 people on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And if they saw the size gesture, so this one, yeah, where it's interrupted, people said things like, for the shape, they said, either a round or square with flat, solid edges. Yeah, so as long as it has solid edges to fit in here, but the actual, it could be either round or square, is what one participant said. Another participant said the shape is probably circular, a cube, or something with a similar height, width, and depth. So notice that they mention multiple different objects, and they say probably, sort of a bit of uncertainty. Another one said, I cannot determine, as I think the gesture was to represent the object's size. Now, this is pretty duh, yeah, but it actually shows that if you're thinking about its size, people express uncertainty about shape, and they mention different shapes. And so this means that if it's a size gesture, it underspecifies shape. And we have quantified this by looking at markers of uncertainty and so on, and there are more markers of uncertainty if it's a size gesture and people are asked to refer to the shape. Now for the size then, they will mention much more precise language. They will use, they talk about specific inches and so on. Now if it's a shape gesture, then people actually mention round shapes, and notice that these are shapes that sometimes fit in the hand and sometimes don't. Yeah, so the size does not matter anymore as long as it's round. And if it's about size, they say things like, I'm unsure, I don't know, hard to tell, probably, and so on. So there's more markers of uncertainty again and less numbers about precise numerical estimates. And so the point of this study is simply that if it's one, it's not the other, and vice versa. And that's a clear experimental demonstration that iconicity has to be selective. If you're selecting size, then you are under-specifying shape and vice versa. Yeah.
In this case, the subjects were judging both. Was within or between subjects?
This was between subjects. Yeah, in this case, this was between subjects. So we generally only show them one because it's a bit weird to, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah. So actually, we've had like we have like a dozen experiments on this. We also, I mean, we did things where we printed these and asked people to draw an object in there, which is really cute. And then people will draw all sorts of differently shaped objects in there. But they will always draw something round, and what is the round thing they draw in there is also sometimes a globe or something bigger. So there's different things that show the same thing, but we generally always do this between subjects because it's kind of weird if you're seeing the same thing.
It would not work.
It would not work as well, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's just showing you the selective nature of iconicity. Okay, and then, and this is the most subtle bit, but actually I think the most important, which is that iconicity is about a sense of resemblance and not about resemblance in an objective sense. And that's a really underappreciated aspect of iconicity that leads to a lot of misconceptions about the phenomenon. So, this is where we get into, it has to happen in any talk on this topic, Kiki and Buba, which is perhaps the most studied effect in this field. And some people are so over this, because there's now hundreds of studies, showing this. So this is actually coming from some very early work, originally from the 20s, where if you show people shapes like this, and I tell you a new word, a non-made-up word, it's Kiki. Do you think this one is Kiki or that one is Kiki? I mean, I've given you the slides in a particular order, but people are much more likely to say that this one is Kiki. And in comparison, in contrast, Buba is this. And Takete is more like this, and Maluma is more like this. This is another example. So it's a bit of a problem in this field to study that people always use the same stimuli, Kiki and Buba, or Takete and Maluma. But the matching behavior is like impressive. Like if you do this, I've done this in open days, like sort of presentations with upcoming students, and it always works like 80–90% of all people will match it. And that's what's been found across studies. It's been replicated many times. About 80% of all people think that Kiki and Buba are along these lines. Now, how could this be iconicity? How can sounds resemble shapes? If you think about it objectively, that makes no sense. Yeah, a sound cannot be round or spiky. And there's a recent critique of our work where Bob Winter and Grylls say it feels wrong to speak of similarities between sounds and objects. And I agree. So with this critique, it is wrong if you're thinking about iconicity being about objective similarity, because a sound cannot be similar to an object in a sort of objective way. So how do we account for this, and how do we think about this in iconicity? So the idea is that we have in our mind, and there's a lot of work on this in psychology, existing crossmodal correspondences. So what is a crossmodal correspondence? A crossmodal correspondence is, you may have heard of synesthesia before. So synesthesia is when people sort of have connections between senses. So like there are people, for example, who when they hear sound, they see a color, or when they feel pain, they see a color. And this is a very rare condition, but the people who have this have very strong sensations of like seeing letters in certain colors and so on. This is now a very well-established phenomenon, and cross-modal correspondence is sort of the smaller version of that. It is less rare and it is shared by the population. So an example of a cross-modal correspondence is people, when you have a high-pitched sound, you're more likely to match that to a bright stimulus, and if you have a low-pitched sound, a darker stimulus is matched to that. So essentially, cross-modal correspondences are established in psychological research by doing these matching tasks. And if a lot of people do the same reliable matching, then you can say there's some sort of connection between pitch and darkness in your mind. What the explanation of that is a separate question, yeah, but the psychological research shows it exists. And so there's tons of these cross-modal correspondences. There's many connections between the senses in our mind. So for example, under certain conditions, hearing something can influence what you feel. And feeling something can influence what you hear. Or people match colors to music. Yeah, certain the pieces of music are blue. That also objectively makes no sense. So these cross-modal correspondences, if they exist anyway in our mind, can be exploited by language for communicative effect. That's the idea here. So they lend a sense of resemblance in the perceiver's mind that isn't there objectively. So how does this work with Kiki and Buba? So this has been studied a lot. We still don't know what the true or what the universal cue for this is. But we know a few things, and they could all be true at the same time. So for example, there's a recent study that has found that if you ask people to rate this shape or that shape for how arousing it is, yeah, arousal is a dimension of sort of, so there's emotion and arousal is one component of that. People think that Kiki is more arousing than Buba. And if you show them the words separately, people rate Kiki as a more arousing than Buba sort of word. So arousing means sort of more active, more engaging, something's more going on, less soothing. And so if there's an arousal difference between the shapes and between the sounds, that is one of the ways in which you can sense some similarity between the two. Yeah, that's one grounds upon which you can establish a similarity that doesn't exist in the stimulus objectively, but they have the similar emotional associations. That's the same way that actually music, we associate blue with sad music, and we warm colors with happy music, and that is the thing that actually has been found to explain the matching behavior. So this is sort of emotional mediation in this case. So that's one thing that has been experimentally established. Another one is only for people who know writing systems. It's been found that actually, if you ask people to rate the spikiness of these letters and the roundness of these letters, they are actually rounder and spikier. So I can just sort of show this. Yeah. And so it turns out that if you are a literate speaker who uses the Roman alphabet, you will have a stronger Buba-Kiki effect. So your matching behavior is amplified. And that suggests that if you are literate, then there's an additional cue that you can use that gives you an additional element of similarity. Yeah? And I'm going to mention one, and that's the most recent one, and it's the most exciting. I should have brought some objects to. Let's see whether this works. So it turns out that if you drop a round object versus it's a bit doesn't work quite as well, but like a slightly more spiky object. I mean, admittedly, I'm cheating here because this is metal and this is not, but you get the idea. But if you were to drop the Kiki shape and you were to drop the Buba shape, it turns out that the acoustics of round objects being dropped have sort of less interruptions and a different frequency profile than the acoustics of spiky shapes. And it turns out that those acoustics are more similar to Kiki and Takete, which also have like more interruptions. Kiki is like a high frequency burst, and Buba and Maluma are sort of more continuous sort of stimuli. And so this is, we have intuitions about these things. And so our intuitive physics might create another sense of similarity here. Now, we don't know which ones of these is more important, and there are actually other ones that have been found. Yeah, people have found other cross-modal similarities. But the key is that all of these together, yeah, could help you sort of solve the mystery of how can you be iconic of something if they're of different modalities. But it's an active area of research to know which ones of those matter, and we still don't know in particular cases. So it's been found that there are patterns, so this is typological research which compares many different languages, and people have found in languages reliable associations between color and sound, between touch and sound, which I'll show you some evidence from our lab in a second, size, so high vowels like E are smaller than A and O across languages, shape, and also a large range of basic vocabulary items. So people have done these studies where you take things like tree, stone, and so on, just regular words, and across languages they're more likely, certain sounds occur more likely in them. And this requires cross-modal correspondences as explanations. Some of these correspond to cross-modal correspondences that we know about. Others, we haven't studied them yet. And so we need to find out what are the cross-modal correspondences. But crucially, this sense of resemblance then sort of unlocks or frees iconicity from being just onomatopoeia, for example, which is sound about sound. Yeah, that's within one modality. It's actually about what you feel or think is similar, not what is objectively similar. Okay, so two more concepts, and then I just realized that I need to really get into the meat very soon. But two more concepts so that you are not confused about things, because this is actually a mistake that a lot of people make. There's a thing in language that looks very similar to iconicity, and that has now the name systematicity. It's a word people use for this. And I'm going to exemplify this with a particular pattern in English. There are things in English and other Germanic languages that are called phonostemes. This is a bit of an old-fashioned term for clusters like gl in glitter, glitz, glisten, gleam, glossy, glimmer. There are many such words, yeah. And all of those, what do they mean? They all mean something shiny visual. Yeah, glitter, glitz, glisten, that has some, I'm making gestures here. But so there is a correspondence between gl occurring in these forms, so there's similarity in form, and there's similarity in meaning. So there's some sort of statistical regularity in the lexicon where these forms tend to occur with these meanings. Now, it's not clearly iconic. It could be, yeah, maybe that's what some speakers feel, but it's not obvious, at least, what is the resemblance between gl and visual shininess. And it turns out that other languages don't have this. Yeah, so that suggests that maybe this intuition is not, this might be a historical artifact of English. And in fact, we know that a lot of these words go back to the same root. And so that seems to be a sort of historical, statistical fluke of the English language, but it is systematic. Yeah. But then other phonostemes are also systematic in the same sense that they are statistical regularities in the lexicon, and iconic. So for example, clonk, clank, clink, boink. All of these are onomatopoeias, and they're all abrupt sounds. Yeah, a clonk sound. And it ends abruptly, and it ends in stops. And that is actually something that's been found across languages. So onomatopoeias for abrupt sounds tend to have end in stops. and like a hiss or fuzz or something like that sort of fizzles out is for a continuous sound. This is a pattern that we recognize immediately is some resemblance between form and meaning. Yeah. So clearly then, systematicity and iconicity are two different dimensions. Yeah, you can be systematic or iconic or either one of these two. The other thing that people often confuse with iconicity is transparency. So people often think that if something is iconic, everybody from any language should guess it. Yeah. So I think this is a bit sort of, if you just even think about it, like if you didn't know what the word tree in American Sign Language is, and I just did this, yeah, and you never heard this, I think without any context, it would be very hard for you to guess that this is a tree. Yeah, and it turns out that there's empirical evidence that people cannot actually guess iconic meanings very good across languages. Better than non-iconic words. Yeah, but they're not guarantee for understanding. So here's a study that used so-called idiophones. So there are languages like Japanese that have huge vocabularies of highly iconic words. So in Japanese you can say goro goro, or yeah. Or something, or like piki piki, or something like that, like for a particular, to imitate a particular, goro goro is for a heavy rolling motion. You might know Pikachu from the Pokemons. That actually comes from an idiophone, pika pika, which is sort of like lightning flash. And there are dictionaries of these, yeah. And Japanese speakers think that these are depictive. They use them for imitation, and they often co-occur with gesture. So they're sort of like highly imitative words. And many other languages outside of Europe have these words. They're actually very common. And Europe, sort of surprisingly, the European languages seem to be idiophone impoverished for whatever reason. But if you take visual idiophones, motion idiophones, shape idiophones, idiophones for sound, so onomatopoeic idiophones, and texture idiophones from various languages. And in this study, they played them to Dutch listeners. Yeah? And this is the proportion of correct. You can see that at most for the highly iconic onomatopoeic words, the highest guessing accuracy is 60%, and that's pretty bad. And that's in a task where you have a forced choice, so you have an alternative. If you had no alternative, like if you just hear pika pika and you didn't know Japanese, it would be impossible for you to guess what it is. And so it's important to think of transparency as a behavioral correlate of iconicity. But it's not iconicity itself, and people confuse this. They think that if something is iconic, it has to be a universal, and every language should do the same.
It's also because it's cultural. So I was thinking when you talk about colors, because colors have different meaning in different cultures. So like white is for that in some Oriental cultures. So of course the emotional also values that have some, and also for iconicity.
Yeah, so people have different perceptual systems based on their cultural background, based on what language they speak. Things sound differently to people from different cultures, and so what they see as iconic in a particular form may differ. Yeah. 100%. Okay, so very quickly then, I just want to show you some actual sort of like two studies that I think are quite fun to exemplify that iconicity then often is systematic. Yeah, so even though iconicity and systematicity are two different notions, if we all share the same intuition, if we all think that E is small, then it makes sense that we would reuse this across many different words. And that would then create a cluster in a lexicon where multiple words that have E's are also for small meanings, and that's systematicity. So iconicity often leads to systematicity. And we've explored this in a study that's called Size, Sound, Symbolism in the English Lexicon, where what we did is we looked at the most frequent English size adjectives, big, large, small, huge, big, large, small, tiny, I think they were, and looked at the synonyms using a thesaurus. Yeah, and so the big ones had large, huge, colossal, jumbo, vast, whopping. I'm doing a bit of cherry picking here because these do all sound quite big, don't they? Whopping, colossal, and then little, meager, midget, itsy bitsy, slight, puny, petite, and so on. And notice that yes, petite is a loan word, but it is a word of the English language and it fits the pattern. So we are treating what is the set of words that is available to the speakers here as the thing that we want to make a claim about. And we then coded them phonologically. Is the sound present or not? So for example, does this word have an E? Teeny has an E. Little has an sound, and so on. And we just simply have a presence absence. We do this for only those that are etymologically unrelated. So for example, if we have mini and miniature and minuscule, that will be like cheating, because then we have 3 data points that are actually one source. So we need to make sure that we're only looking at etymologically unrelated adjectives. And we are looking only at the roots. So for teeny and bulky, we're getting rid of the morphology, because that again will be like cheating, because then of course all of the, like a lot of them will have e's in them because of the morphology. So we're only looking at the roots. And we're then training a machine learning algorithm on trying to predict whether the word is a synonym of small or big from the sounds alone. And what we use here is an algorithm that's called random forests. Yeah? Ultimately, actually, it doesn't really matter, because you could use logistic regression or other techniques and it would yield similar results. But we can talk about how this algorithm works in detail if you're interested. But what we, I'm going to not talk about that. But what's cool is that you can then check, can this algorithm that's been trained on this predict a new word that it hasn't seen? Yeah. This is called cross-validation. Yeah, so you're training it, for example, on teeny and little. It hasn't seen bulky, and now you're giving it bulky. Can you predict whether it's small or large from that? Yeah, and you do this by doing sort of repeated subsets. You're training it on one bit and then testing it on the other. You're training it on another bit and then testing it on the other. And the cross-validation accuracy of classifying this turns out to be 77%. Yeah. In fact, actually, some colleagues of mine, because I'm not an expert actually in machine learning, it's not my expertise within stats, I'm actually specialized in something else. Actually, turns out that they found ways of making this accuracy even better, because we used some wrong settings. But either way, it's pretty good. And it is way above chance, yeah, because this is a mostly balanced data set, so 50% will be chance. And what this means is that knowing the sound of the word, you can predict its meaning in this particular size adjective corner of the lexicon. Now, there's also a data set that's recently been published of size ratings for all sorts of words. This is the Glasgow norms. You're like, oh, I could use this for, there's so much free data out there, isn't it? And so people have rated words for size, and this includes nouns and adjectives and so on. And so, for example, flea is actually that fits kind of, and that has a low, like a small size rating, and universe is a big thing. Now, clearly, nouns are much more multidimensional. Yeah, size is only one of the things. Yeah, universe is much more than just a big thing. And there are many small things that are like flea. And so, would we expect the algorithm to do as well here? And if you think about the idea that iconicity is selective, no, we should not, because where should we expect size iconicity to be the most? Well, in size words, which are specifically about size, and then people can imitate size. But in these words, which are about much more than just size, we shouldn't necessarily expect to see iconicity. And the same method performs much worse. Yeah, so it's much harder. Slightly above chance, even so you can look at only the concrete words, you can look at only adjectives, only nouns, only verbs, whatever, it always hovers around a pretty low number, much lower than the one in the size adjectives. And I think this comparison is a nice example of selectivity again. And people have sort of sometimes said, oh, but universe is a big word, and it doesn't sound big. You're expecting too much from iconicity. If you are thinking that every word should be doing it, it should be where it matters the most, where it's actually possible to be iconic. And then if you're looking at what words or what sounds are predictive, t turns out to 61% of the small words tend to have t in them as opposed to big. This has also been observed in other languages. T has a high frequency burst. It's known that t makes the next vowel a little higher in voice pitch. So there are many reasons why this could be the case. E is more frequent in small words, and 40% of all small words have and then R is the reverse. So that does not occur. The R sound does not occur in the small words in this data set. And these are the 4 most predictive phonemes. And actually, that's another important thing is people have always focused on just E or something else. It's a probabilistic pattern. Yeah, so you need, like, it's across different sounds. Okay. So then, this study I'm really excited about. So this is size vocabulary. Let's move to touch. We have looked at touch roughness ratings. So perceptual psychologists know that roughness, if you're comparing surfaces, and you say this surface to that surface, people are, what determines surface similarity turns out to be mostly, the primary determinant is roughness. And that kind of makes sense because roughness is evolutionary important. We don't want to touch rough surfaces. We could hurt ourselves and so on. But because perceptual psychologists are interested in this, they have roughness ratings and free data. So let's do the same thing that we did for the size adjectives. And actually, if you just look at this, rough, abrasive, prickly, rugged, rocky, scratchy, bristly, these words in this data set, it's quite obvious that in English there already is a lot of words that have R's in them. And I actually found this out by just looking at the words. Like it jumps at you when you look at this data set. And then you have smooth, oily, silky, slick, satony, velvety, slimy, gooey, and sleek. And this was actually part of my PhD thesis. And my dad, who actually turns out to be also has a linguistic background, and he proofread the entire PhD thesis. He read this bit and he's like, Bodo, this is bullshit. Like, this makes no sense. I don't believe this is true. So I had to convince my dad and find some more evidence and team up with some amazing people to help me in this project, because it turned out to become much bigger than we expected. So the first thing is, we can use the same approach. We can look at whether we can predict the meaning, whether it's rough or smooth. We can do this continuously or categorically, using the continuous ratings, or is it just rough or smooth, from the sound alone. And we have 100 touch adjectives, like the ones that you just saw. And it turns out, actually, languages have a lot of words for describing touch. We care about touch a lot. And this graph is an output of the same approach, random forest analysis. To the right here means it is more predictive. It is helping you to predict the meaning distinction. And what you can see is that R is massively the most predictive sound of this distinction in the English data. And so here we have the roughness ratings, and words with R have much higher roughness than words without R. Okay, so then, as a German speaker, I noticed that schroff, kratzig, rau, maybe some other words come to mind, schroff, kratzig, rau, I'll think of some others. I was just like, this could work in German as well. And so we were thinking, let's actually look at whether this is the case in Indo-European languages. So we actually used for this Google Translate, but we checked it with native speakers, like a few of them, and it works pretty well. We have some translation people in the audience who might be shocked about that. And here I'm showing you the proportion of rough words that have, how many of those have R. You can see there's more red over here. For each dot is one European language. And in this case, each dot is one European language, and the size is how many words we have for that language. So for some languages, we don't have as many translations because Google Translate tends to be really bad for small languages. And so you can see that the rough words have a much higher proportion of R's than the smooth words, and this is controlling for whether the languages are related. Yeah, so this is using a mixed model, which has a random effect for language relation. Okay, so in Indo-European, some of this might be due to historical accidents. So we know actually that, for example, the slur pattern in the smooth words, yeah, which doesn't, L is sort of the counterpart of rough. Slick, slippery, and slimy all go back to the same root. Yeah, so if we're doing this Indo-European analysis, we're again sort of cheating actually. But the cool thing is, if you're looking at the Proto-Indo-European roots, the original words that have been reconstructed 6 to 8,000 years ago, the ancestral language to all European languages, 44% of those have R in them if they are for rough meaning in a modern language. And only 8% of the smooth words have R in them. So it's a pretty strong effect. So it seems to be the case that in the past, this pattern already existed in the ancestral language and has sort of maintained and persisted throughout 6 to 8,000 years, pretty long time. But it's Indo-European, so it could just be one accident. So let's do this with an unrelated language, same approach. So we got roughness ratings for Hungarian, and it turns out that R is hugely predictive, is also, but it turns out to actually occur at very few sounds, so it doesn't help you. And so we focus here on R and find the same pattern. And so then we were like, okay, if it works in Hungarian and English and Indo-European, does it work on the planet? So we looked at 330 languages using CLICS, which is the cross-linguistic co-lexification database, where you have one translation equivalent and you can get the phonological forms of many languages. And we had 330 of those. And here are rough words that have R and no R. And you can see there's more blue for the smooth ones over here, so less R over here. And what's cool is we can have languages that have a trilled R, like German has, and Italian has the one that I can't pronounce. Yeah, thank you. And it turns out that if your language has a trilled R, it's much more likely to be on the rough word than on the smooth word. So there's a big difference here. And here, each dot is a language family now. And the size is how many languages there are in the language family. But it is another sort of R, like for example, the Japanese flap, which is not really an R sound in the sort of sense. Then the effect is not present. And that seems to suggest that it's the trilling, the flapping of the tongue, that is matched iconically to the rough surfaces. And that fits perceptual research, which shows that it's the roughness of a surface is determined by intermittency of the surface. And so it's an intermittent sound that's matched to an intermittent touch thing. And so I think this is the likely basis, the likely crossmodal correspondence that lies behind this pattern of iconicity. Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm running out of time. Can I go 1 hour and 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. Sorry for keeping you hostage here. Just get too excited about this. But as Mariana mentioned, it's important to study a phenomenon from multiple different perspectives. So there's a completely different approach to studying iconicity, which is to just ask native speakers, is this iconic or not? And that actually turns out to really work quite well. So we did this with 3,000 English words. We asked 2,500 American English speakers to rate words for how much does it sound like what it means. Yeah, so imagine you're sitting on a computer and you see hissing, and then you have a scale, and people will say hissing very much sounds like what it is. And you have gurgle, hissing, humming, click, so they're all onomatopoeias, but crucially not all of them. So zigzag is not an onomatopoeia, but English speakers have the intuition it sounds like what it means. And then missile, dolphin, does not sound like what it means. Yeah, so we have the scale from arbitrary or non-iconic to iconic. And we've correlated this scale with all sorts of things. So once you have like a scale, you can do correlations. So together with Lynn Perry, who's a developmental scientist, we looked at age of acquisition. So there are ratings for whether a word is acquired early or late. And so to the right here means the word is relatively acquired later. This is judgments by adult speakers, taken with a grain of salt, but it's been used widely in psycholinguistics. And early acquired words, it's a small effect. It's a really small effect, yeah? Like there's a lot of scatter here. But clearly, there is a trend, and this is controlling for frequency and concreteness. So even for controlling for these things, the more iconic a word is, the earlier it is acquired. Yeah? But it's ratings, and that's not the best. So we also looked at real production data from children. And as a corpus, the childless data, which we looked at data from over 300 children from months 12 to 69. And now this plot is a 3D plot. Sorry, 3D can be very hard, so let me unpack this for you. This is the prediction from a mixed model, and it predicts the following plane. So up here means the word is more frequent. Children say this word more often, yeah? And then we have iconicity. And so if we just go to the youngest children on this axis and just focus on this, the more iconic the word is, the more often it is produced. Yeah, for the very young children in this sample. Now, if we go to the very old children, we actually see that the relationship flips. And the oldest children in this sample already produce the most iconic words, the least frequent. So there's this sort of bootstrapping, people talk about it like this, where maybe the early words help you to get into the language because the meanings sort of give away, or the form gives away some of the meaning, and children might also think they're more fun, they're more engaging, more imitative, and then later on you learn more arbitrary, non-iconic words. Thank you. And then we also found that if you're looking at, in the childless corpus, the parental input frequency, so whether children, mothers and fathers talk with their children, more iconic words are used more often by the parents. And if you're looking at any other corpus, and it doesn't matter which one, frequency is anti-correlated with iconicity. So adults amongst each other don't use iconic words as much, and they tend to maybe disprefer them. But they prefer them when speaking with children. And I think that's really cool, like maybe because the parents have the intuition that these words might be more fun or easier. Okay, so now, hopefully out very soon, we have replicated this with 14,000 English words, new data set, so you can use it and correlate whatever you want. And so I'm showing you a plot of a model where we're predicting iconicity based on a whole bunch of other ratings that exist and other sort of scales. And to the right here means the thing is positively correlated with iconicity. And it turns out that there are humor ratings for words. Somebody collected those. That might be useful if you're studying humor. And it turns out that, come on, show me the words, smooch, waddle, pop, oink, and zigzag, they're all iconic and they also sound funny. Yeah? And so there seems to be this correlation in the lexicon. It's actually the strongest correlation we find. We find that the more sensory a word is, the more iconic it is. That kind of makes sense. If I'm asking you, make a sound for democracy or freedom, and you're like, whoo. It's really hard to do for abstract concepts. Yeah, you can only be iconic if something which has perceptual material. Okay, the words are unusual in their shape, structural markedness. They are acquired earlier, so age of acquisition is negatively correlated, and this one I'm going to skip. So now the ratings have been critiqued, yeah, because people are sort of, especially linguists, are suspicious of asking native speakers. Sort of sometimes. And in particular, ratings are sort of a tool from psychology, and so people were sort of like, I don't want to rely on this. And so Arthur Lewis Thompson, Kimiya Kita, and Young Ado have a really cool paper where they collect iconicity ratings for Japanese. And they find all sorts of interesting patterns, so they replicate the method for a new language. But then in the discussion section, they do a U-turn and say, but actually the iconicity ratings are bullshit. Yeah, and the reason why they say is, we don't know what is the perceptual analog. If you're saying this is highly iconic, how do I know that this is not just you making up like this is iconic? Maybe a native speaker thinks that cat is cat versus dog is iconic. So can we really take the native speaker at face value? And we then wrote a response to this and said, well, actually, if you're looking at this pattern of correlations, yeah, the fact that it correlates with age of acquisition, it correlates with sensory meaning, it correlates with funniness and so on, these are things that have been proposed prior to us collecting the iconicity ratings. Iconicity has been claimed to be about sensory stuff. Iconicity has, prior to the ratings, been claimed to be about early words. And so the pattern of correlations does suggest some sort of construct validity in the sense that these are the correlations we expect if it was actually iconicity. So that's one argument for this being a good measure. We really like if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. It turns out in their study, idiophones, so goro goro, pika pika, and so on, have higher iconicity ratings, exactly as we would expect. It turns out that words that lexicographers think are iconic, yeah, are also higher in iconicity ratings. Again, a sort of validity measure, I would say. The ratings do correlate with foreign word guessing accuracy. So Bonnie McLean has done some really cool research showing that words rated high in iconicity are also slightly more likely to be guessed correctly, as we would expect. And other things, and notice that the touch pattern that I've talked about, the trilled R, we found this because actually, like I started looking at the touch words because touch in English has high iconicity ratings. And this is an example of, first we found the ratings, and then we found a real pattern in the language. So just because you don't know what the analogy is, and you don't know for any one word what is the correspondence, doesn't mean that these ratings are invalid. And it's just another measure. I'm not saying it's the Holy Grail, it's just one other way of studying iconicity, and you can do correlations with it. And that's the argument we make in this paper. Okay, I'm going to very quickly just talk about this, just so there's a huge piece of work where people have to do things like, Francesca gave me this game, like a charades game, where you have sounds and you have to give a sound and the other person has to guess them. And you know, like taboo with gesture and this sort of stuff. There's actually people who are doing these experiments. And it turns out that in these experiments, people are always using iconicity. Yeah, they're using iconicity because if you are making up a sound and you cannot use your own language, what else would you use? Yeah, you're not going to make an arbitrary sound. And so it's been found again and again in study after study that people will use some form of iconicity in these language evolution experiments. So it seems that new linguistic science needs some kind of transparency in order to be interpretable at all. Yeah, so iconicity is not the same as transparency, but it gives you a little bit more of that, and so your chances of being understood if you're making a new communication systems are higher. Okay, I'm going to skip through. We have some studies on this as well, but I want to talk about. Yeah, but I want to talk about the title was the linguistic sign isn't arbitrary. That was a pretty bold title. And actually, if you think about it, nothing that I've shown you so far actually contradicts that title. And in a way, actually, what I've said is, well, you could say, okay, the sensory words are more iconic. Well, that means that the non-sensory words are arbitrary, isn't it? Yeah. So surely then, the rest of all the words, you could even use the data that I've shown you as evidence for arbitrariness. Yeah, I mean, yes, we've shown more iconicity than maybe previously assumed, but you could flip everything and say, it is actually about, it's actually an evidence for arbitrariness. So let's actually, and here I'm going to go a little bit more terminological, are they really arbitrary? So it turns out that what people mean by arbitrariness is not so clear. And people complain about iconicity being ill-defined. People cite arbitrariness and often sometimes with actually defining what arbitrariness is. And this is sort of funny, like everybody complains about iconicity being a terminological mess. I actually think it's like arbitrariness is the real culprit here. So we have done sort of close reading of the literature, and there's some philosophers who've problematized this as well, that there are actually different uses of the word arbitrary in the literature. And some of these are inconsistent or logically independent of each other. So the first one is, if you think about, if you weren't a linguist and you never heard of Surah or anything, what is the word arbitrary? Well, kind of when somebody makes something up, like something is random, unpredictable. So just looking at a dictionary definition, existing or coming about seemingly at random or by chance or as a capricious, unplanned and unreasonable act of will. Yeah, that's sort of our intuition of the word arbitrary. And then we have to unlearn that when we take linguistics classes. Okay, so now you could say, okay, linguists can use a word from natural language and make their own definition. I mean, that's what science does all the time, isn't it? So that's fine, but it will always have this semantic baggage, and I think it leads to misunderstandings. So here's one study from like way back that talks about arbitrary as due to chance, yeah, which is not actually what Surah even meant by this. It's not that forms are matched to meanings randomly. Yeah, there's a history within each language. Then we have, in another study, somebody paraphrased arbitrary with random. So again, I think this is a sort of misunderstanding here. Here is, in a recent review paper, we could easily decide that from now on, tall should be synonymous with blue. And I'd say, no, we can't. Yes, hypothetically, perhaps, as you could sort of say counterfactually, but Surah was quite adamant about the fact that the sign, the form-meaning relation is immutable. You cannot change that. No individual can change it. Yeah, it's inherited through time. So, but notice that these misunderstandings, I think, only come from the fact that we use the word arbitrary, and I don't think it's the right reference concept from natural language, perhaps, or at least it has the wrong semantic associations. Okay, now, Charles Hawkins, who we've seen previously, defines iconicity as, arbitrariness as, the word salt is not salty nor granular, dog is not canine, and whale is a small word for a large object, microorganism is the reverse. Yeah. So notice that we've already seen, like we shouldn't expect these words to be iconic. That's what our study has shown. But also, okay, that's arbitrariness. This is just a few examples you're citing, and actually you're negatively defining it. You're just saying what arbitrariness is not. You're saying it's not iconicity. And so that's a bit dissatisfying. So in this book by Rudi Keller, who actually comes from Düsseldorf and Cologne, so like that area, he says negative characterizations, like saying that arbitrariness is not iconicity or arbitrariness is not systematicity, are by nature not very convincing. It will be more interesting to find out what arbitrariness consists than in what it does not. And now there's a monster that's been constructed in this literature that is non-arbitrariness. Because if arbitrary is not iconic, non-arbitrariness is not iconic, and it's kind of weird. But also notice that this bit then collapses across the iconic systematic distinction, because if you can be arbitrary, if arbitrary means not iconic and not systematic, it's actually arbitrariness which leads to a conflation in the literature of systematicity and iconicity, because both are the joint opponents of the same concept. And that's a problem, because as we've seen, there are two different things. So if somebody says in the literature, this is arbitrary, we don't know whether they mean this or that. Yeah, and that's problematic. So for example, this study, famously, and this has been critiqued a lot, how arbitrary is language, the only thing they show is that there is systematicity, and this study has nothing to do with iconicity. Yeah, they only look at statistical regularities in the lexicon, and so you can see how the arbitrariness concept leads to confusion in this literature. In the same study, actually, ironically, they define arbitrariness in terms of lacking guessability. Given the sound of an unknown word, it is not possible to infer its meaning. And we've seen that this is just the behavioral correlate of iconicity. So we cannot now, yes, arbitrary forms, non-iconic forms are more likely to be not guessed correctly, but that's just a behavioral way of measuring something. It's not about the actual form-meaning relationship. And more importantly, perhaps, whether there are different forms for the same meaning is a separate issue from whether something is iconic or not. So this is why Watson and colleagues introduce a new concept that I think is really useful. It's optionality, whether you have the option of having different forms, but the options themselves can be iconic or not iconic. And that's why we need the arbitrariness concept collapses these two things, because it says it's not iconic and different languages have the same thing, have different things. But actually, they are two different things, and we should distinguish them because they matter, because you can have this difference in language, but also in language evolution. You might have different, people generate different iconic signals, and they're all iconic, but they're different ones. There are different options of iconic signals as well. Okay, so very briefly then, I think what is the actual thing that what really means something and it is useful is conventionality. As has been pointed out by Linda Waugh, who's a sort of linguist and literature scholar, that there's often an erroneous conflation of conventionality and arbitrariness in the literature. And actually sign language researchers have said the same. Sorry for a long quote, but actually Adam Shebri is in our department, a sign language researcher. He says, because most symbols in spoken languages are both arbitrary and conventionalized, it seems some linguists mistakenly assumed that a defining feature of language was arbitrariness. In fact, it is conventionalization that is the key to understanding the relationship. So, if we're looking down the list of his features, so I'm going to skip this, and if we're actually looking down the list, we have traditional transmission, which is the fact that I got this word from you. If I'm a child, I'm learning it from you. And if we agree on this form means that meaning, I would say, and I will give you some examples, that we get arbitrariness, that what people call arbitrariness, for free. Because if we agree on a convention, we don't need iconicity to understand the meaning. So the idea here is then that, for example, if you have the Old English form chlechan, which means laughter, and it's clearly iconic, at least it seems very clearly iconic, like laughing, yeah. If you hear this the very first time, you may use iconicity to get the meaning, if this is a completely novel form, if it's an imitation. But once we agree on this, and chlechan means that, you don't need iconicity to understand that because you've heard it before. Yeah, you have a rule now. And so that means then that sound changes that happen anywhere in the language, like H becomes nothing in English, or H becomes F, and then the word becomes laughter, which is less iconic. Because we have a convention, we sort of free the sign from having to rely on iconicity. Yeah, but notice that these changes are not really arbitrary, they're actually functionally motivated. Like we know sound changes are functionally motivated. They happen on all words, and it's not that the words want to be arbitrary, they just find themselves to be lacking in iconicity after these sound changes have applied to every word. So Maria Flaxman calls this de-iconization. And she has this cool quote, all these mundane factors of language evolution leave their trace on iconic words, unobtrusively tearing apart form and meaning. So the idea is that if any language change, open up any historical linguistics book, any change that applies to all words will most likely erode iconicity. Because if something is very specifically about one sound being one matched with one meaning, then that is a very brittle state of affairs. And then there's also functional pressure. So maybe the words want to be non-systematic so that they're not confusable. And we reduce words over time, we make them shorter and so on, to the extent that these processes don't care about iconicity, they will destroy iconicity. So, going back to Saussure, I think he was all right in basically pretty much everything, but there's a subtle shift. So for example, when he says that PPO became pigeon, where PPO is more iconic of birdsong, sort of like, and pigeon is less iconic, he says that this example is an obvious proof that they, the words, lose something of their original character of being iconic in the first place, to assume that the linguistic sign in general, which is unmotivated, which is arbitrary. And I think the error here is that the word PPO doesn't want to be arbitrary. It's just the changes happen anyway, and so arbitrariness is not an evolutionary target. But the problem is by making it a principle, we think of it as a target, we think of it as something that sort of matters. And so I would say, actually, yes, a lot of forms are not iconic. I totally agree with this, yeah? But it's not that arbitrariness has consequences. It is the consequence of other things. So it's actually the other way around. It's kind of epiphenomenal. And we can derive all the properties that we care about, that clearly languages have different forms for the same meaning, from conventionality. So basically everything that's been said that arbitrariness does actually is rooted in the fact that we have conventions. Okay, that's what I want to leave you with. Just very briefly, teaser of upcoming work. We're looking at bird onomatopoeias, and we have annotated during lockdown because we had nothing else to do. We've annotated lots of bird field guides where we can actually predict the real size of the bird from the onomatopoeias, which is pretty cool. And so very happy to talk about that at some point. That's the sort of the roundup talk. And I want to thank you out there, Anita, for listening, and out here. Thank you.
Brilliant. So thank you very much. Let's see, are there questions, comments here in the room or from online? Maybe you can raise your electronic hand. Let's see, are there questions from here in the room? Comments, ideas? Julia?
Thank you for your talk, it was brilliant. Lots of interesting stuff. If we are linguists, it's just like, it's fascinating. And I have two questions that's more like general talk. One is about the fact that when we talk about iconicity and also thinking about in this evolutionary perspective, everything makes sense against also the universal grammar. So Chomsky, the idea of universal grammar, and it's not like there is this faculty of language that is a priori, but it's like because we started with iconicity, and iconicity, of course, in a communication system is in general.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. This.
But it's not innate, isn't it? That's the.
No, it's not innate.
Exactly.
That's like because it's communication, and of course, in this case, there are things that are more general, so the iconicity could explain lots of things.
Oh, lots of things.
Always have been related to this faculty of language.
Yeah, so actually very quickly, two thoughts on this. So one is, I do actually think that our drive to imitate, that humans have a very unique drive to imitate that is like, yes, animals can also imitate, but it's been shown again and again that like in terms of sort of comparisons to great apes, we are much better at vocal imitation, we're much better at gestural imitation, and I think that might be something that's actually innate, but as a capacity that then creates systems further down the line. And the other thing is, it turns out, I think it's a really sort of shift in the field where there's now actually formal semanticists and Chomskyan syntacticians who are taking serious the idea that actually universal grammar might have some iconicity or might interact with iconicity. So it's really interesting that, because they were traditionally very opposed to this, that they're sort of actually realizing maybe there's something to this story. Yeah.
Thank you. And then the other one is related to the cross-modality. So I was thinking also if it was studied from also neurocognitive level, because it's also linked, in my opinion, to the idea that it's not like a language system in the mind is like centered in just one area, but it's diffused. So of course there is this interconnection, and I was wondering if there are studies also in neurolinguistics and iconicity.
Oh yeah. So so we recently have access to an MEG device, so we want to do some of that. There's been one fMRI study that I know of that has found that this is with Japanese idiophones, that they activate wider sensory areas in the brain. So the idea being that they sort of like literally more sensorily engaging, because an idiophone is almost like an invitation to think about how it would be like. And so, but I think there's much more that needs to be done, and in particular in English, a language without idiophones, this has not been done yet. So I think, like in terms of neuroscience, there's a lot that could be done here. Yeah. But I mean, I think as we talked about, it's like I also like to stay away from brains because I'm a behavioral sort of scientist and
not you personally, but it's interesting because the emotional also related to some iconic words. It's really interesting to see how they are correlated.
Yeah, in fact, actually, I mean, there's a whole topic that I haven't talked about is affective iconicity. So this has been studied in particular by literature scholars who've also done this statistically. So they looked at whether poems that are good or bad tend to have over or underrepresentation of certain sounds. And so that's another like dimension in which you could like sort of look at this from a brain perspective, looking at the connection between what emotional associations particular sounds make. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate your studies. And okay, I have two little questions and then general consideration.
Yeah.
First of all, about when you talk about the letter shapes study, it was about Castley, I think.
Yeah, Christine Castley.
Is this was this made also with other kind of alphabet rather than our alphabet, for example? Because I was thinking about Cyrillic, for example. I used to speak Russian a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe it doesn't really match. Actually, it depends also between the big the cursive. I don't know how to say in English, cursivo.
Yeah. Yeah, cursive writing. Yeah.
Changes a lot, and sometimes like spiky shapes becomes like more round.
Yeah.
For example. So like I was wondering this, and the second one was about also for that, like it was yeah, maybe I missed that part. It was only in English this case, or also in other languages?
It's also been observed in a lot of other languages. I mean, of course, you cannot have this in Japanese, for example, where you can't have sounds at the end.
Okay.
But
it was the case also in other languages between like the fact that there are these bonus things.
Yeah, abrupt sounds. Yeah.
No, because it's. I mean, in general, I think it's always once you have done it, so it's a really good job to make like cross-linguistic comparison in this case.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then I wanted to share that first I was really attracted, but also like not full maybe about the title that you put. And I did already saw one of your lectures. It was about like 3 years ago. I think.
Oh, the Aberlin
3-day symposium about abstract context.
Oh, that one.
And, yeah, and then there I think I might be wrong, but the title was like the form of the word itself. It actually matters. I don't know if it was something like that. I don't know, but it's something I noted on your when I heard you.
Yeah.
So like, and this sounded like more like that. So like I thought, okay, this title is a big step forward, no?
Yeah.
And then like you actually convinced me in the end about conventionality, because conventionality I think is about thing. I mean, because what I think is that, for example, about like the Kiki and Buba example, for example, no? I think that, for example, I think it's the same also in English, the difference between deaf consonants and sound consonants, T, K, B. So like, maybe it's just about the fact that it's a conventionality to it's an agreement, like a code, so language, to connect these sounds with some kind of things, or anyway, like it's a convention to the iconicity to maybe I just wanted to share with you to match something with a part of that thing. Which is not about meaning, but for example, the first example you did was a cuckoo, for example.
Yeah.
That it matches not with the form of the shape of the bird, but with the sound that you make. So like you choose, you make an agreement, like a conventionality about you choose something to connect that thing with. Which might not be the same for everyone, of course. And it's related to culture and everything. And then it's a huge word about crossmodal correspondences, for example, in music. Just about think about music, like blue with jazz and like those kind of.
Okay. So
I stopped. But
lots of things. Okay. So, okay, cool. So working backwards. So first of all, cuckoo actually is a great example, because you're right. There's a selection happening there because the cuckoo makes other calls as well. So the cuckoo is the most salient of the sounds. That is the most recognizable. And across languages, unrelated languages will have something like kukuk or something like that for that, because it is its most recognizable sound. But there's a selection happening there because it could have been another sound, or you could have imitated the size of it and something like that. So for actually, there's also size sound symbolism for other birds and also shape sound symbolism for other birds. It's been reported by anthropologists. So 100% agree with you. And I 100% agree with you that it's conventionalized. So iconicity itself can become conventionalized. So we can, not only do we agree on an iconic form, but also certain patterns are used so often that we will use them again. Like the iconicity itself is a sort of conventionalized form. So in Japanese, voiced stops are much more used for bigger or heavier objects. And that is a very conventionalized pattern in the idiophone vocabulary. So if you're creating a new idiophone from scratch, you can rely on this conventionalized form of iconicity. So I agree with you there. And yes, if you've seen our earlier talks, and my earlier talks on this topic, my view of this has shifted in the sense that previously I thought that, hey, we have all this cool evidence. And now I'm thinking, well, actually, and I used, in our own papers, we used the phrase arbitrary word. And we wouldn't use this now anymore because, first of all, it's easy to paraphrase with what it actually is, non-iconic word. And that's less confusing because the word could be arbitrary in other ways, as you've seen. So there's a terminological reason to avoid arbitrariness because of this literature mess. But there's also a conceptual reason to avoid it because the true cognitive capacity that underlies this is conventionality. And that's the thing that really matters also for evolutionary perspective. So I think that's how we have shifted from viewing this as an epiphenomenon. We shifted from terminological problem to viewing this as an epiphenomenon to actually, it's not even a thing, it is actually something else. And it's just been mislabeled. So it's a sort of like evolution of our thoughts on this. And then finally, you asked the question about Cyrillic and other scripts. We have a paper on this, where we looked at 900 speakers from 26 different languages with Kiki and Buba online. And we had people from different scripts. And so we could show that it's specifically the Roman script that gives you a boost. So speakers of Roman scripts have higher, stronger Buba Kiki effect. And we looked at how are Buba Kiki spelled in those languages. So we showed them Korean spelling of Buba and Kiki and Cyrillic and so on, and whether people could match that, and whether the matching accuracy sort of relates to predicting the boost across languages, and turns out not to be the case. So it seems that it's specifically sort of the Roman alphabet.
Maybe they have the other two different ways to say Kiki and Buba. Other two Kiki and Buba.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting to actually observe that. It's a fun fact and a curious fact that there seems to be iconicity in the letters. There's some correspondence there, and there's some people who are studying that, which kind of makes sense because writing systems always come from iconic origins. So it would be interesting to explore that. But then I don't know why Cyrillic and other languages it doesn't work so well.
Thank you very much, and I think I promise I don't say anything anymore.
No, because we are already running out of time.
Okay.
We have a last question.
It would be abstract concept.
Abstract
concepts,
biggest challenge.
Yeah, abstract concepts. Yeah.
So we have a last question from Luisa online.
Hey, Luisa.
Hi.
Hi.
From one of the students of course. First, thanks for the talk, and I just want have some reflection on the passage from a phonosymbolic system to an arbitrary system, and in particular on the reason and forces that push in this transformation. I know it's a long talk, but just something general to know.
Yeah. I mean, I think, is that the question or is that the comment?
It was a question.
Okay. Can you repeat what the question is?
Can you give us some reflection of this passage? Okay.
Okay, cool. So I think the evidence is really compelling for this, where whatever system that we know of started in more iconic and became less iconic over time. I'm not saying it became more arbitrary over time, but I'm saying it became more non-iconic over time. Writing systems like Chinese characters started out as pictograms and became less iconic. Scripts are a good example of this. In the language evolution experiments, if you are inventing new signs and then you're repeating this between two people, they become less iconic over time in the language evolution experiment. So there seems to be this general principle where both in language learning and in language evolution, so both ontogenetically and phylogenetically, language is more likely to start iconic, but then quickly loses iconicity. I think that's the sort of general principle that we can now quite clearly see across different examples.
Okay, thanks.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. No, because I know that somebody might have class now, so
yeah, sorry for keeping you hostage.
No, it's perfect. We are in perfect time. Thank you again to all the participants and to Bodo for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Okay.
That was a marathon.
Yeah, that was a marathon actually in the end. Yeah, sorry for that. I didn't.
No. It was fantastic.
My slides were a bit too filled with.
No, so many things.
Yeah.
If you want, great.